We now have a national debt of $9 trillion. We have entitlements of $70 trillion, and we're dumping on the laps of these young people who are upset about what we're giving them, and we need to change it. Now, we got into this mess because we get a bunch of politicians in Washington that like to be reelected and they like power. So therefore, they say, what do you need? You need stuff here, there, whatever. And the politicians gives it to them, and they get reelected. Now, there's something happening now. It's not going to play anymore because the country is going bankrupt. We don't have the facility to do it. Our good jobs have gone overseas. We can't run the war, and we can't run our domestic spending without borrowing $2.5 billion every single day, most of it coming from, unbelievably, the Chinese. This has to change. But it cannot change without a reassessment of what we believe in. Do we believe in the Constitution? Do we believe that we should have the rule of law? Do we believe that sound money ought to be gold and silver and not printed money out of thin air?
Congress, in essence, has ceded total control of the value of our money to a secretive central bank. Congress created the Federal Reserve, yet it had no constitutional authority to do so. We forget that those powers not explicitly granted to the Congress by the Constitution are inherently denied to the Congress, and thus the authority to establish a central bank was never given. Of course, Jefferson and Hamilton had that debate early on, and the debate seemingly was settled in 1913. But transparency and oversight are something else, and they're worth considering. Congress, although not by law, essentially has given up all its oversight responsibilities over the Fed. There are no true audits. Congress knows nothing of the conversations, the plans, and the action taken in concert with other central banks. We get less and less information regarding the money supply each year, especially now that we don't even have access to M3 statistics. The role the Fed plays in the President's secretive working group on financial markets goes essentially unnoticed by Congress. The Federal Reserve shows no willingness to inform Congress voluntarily about how often the working group meets, what action it takes that affects the financial markets, or why it takes these actions. But all these actions directed by the Federal Reserve alter the purchasing power of our money. And that purchasing power is always reduced. The dollar today is worth only 4 cents compared to the dollar that the Federal Reserve started with in 1913. This has significant consequences on our economy and our political stability. All paper currencies are vulnerable to collapse, and history is replete with examples of great suffering caused by these collapses, especially to the nation's poor and the middle class. This can lead to political turmoil as well. Even before a currency collapses, the damage done by a fiat system is significant. Our monetary system insidiously transfers wealth from the poor and the middle class to the privileged rich. Wages never keep up with profits on Wall Street and the banks, thus sowing the seeds of class and discontent. When economic trouble hits, free markets and free trade are often blamed, while the harmful effects of a fiat monetary system are ignored.
Congressman Paul, Pete from Rochester Hills, Michigan, wants to ask you this. If you were president, would you work to phase out the IRS?
Immediately.
That's what they call a softball.
And you can only do that if you change our ideas about what the role of government ought to be. If you think the government has to take care of us from cradle to grave, and if you think our government should police the world and spend hundreds of billions of dollars on a foreign policy that we cannot manage, you can't get rid of the IRS. But if you want to lower taxes, and if you want the government to quit printing the money to come up with the shortfall and cause all the inflation, you have to change policy.
The Bush administration is pushing and pushing hard. A partnership between the United States and Mexico and Canada with a goal of what it calls integration by 2010. This partnership among three nations is being discussed at the highest levels of the three governments at the urging of the largest multinational corporations. But it is barreling ahead with absolutely no congressional oversight, no voter approval, out of sight completely of the American people, and as far as we can determine, without any constitutional authority whatsoever.
We're coming into a cyclical bottom for gold, and it rises going into December, January, so that might be the reverse of the dollar fall. Apart from that, I think one thing people who are dollar-based need to focus on is the Amero. That's the one thing that nobody's talking about, but I think is going to have a big impact on everybody's life in Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. If you Google it, you'll find out all about it.
Well, you could tell us a little bit more right now.
You always hear it on CNBC. The Amero is the proposed new currency for the North American community, which is being developed right now between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico to make a borderless community, much like the EU, and the dollar, Canadian dollar, U.S. dollar, and the Mexican peso replaced by the Amero.
You really think that will get any leeway?
You may want to visit a couple of websites and see how far along it is. The Canadians are pretty upset about it, whereas the Americans, apart from the Texans, are the only people who know anything about it. The rest of the public's really sort of with their head in the sand on this one.
We lost more than 23 soldiers this past weekend. How much longer can the insanity continue here without a strategy that provides us with the strategic withdrawal to an over-the-horizon force has been advocated on this floor by colleagues on both sides of the aisle? Why is it that Ron Paul is the only presidential candidate that has the nerve on the Republican side to talk about it without fear of being called unpatriotic or, in fact, booed in an audience? This chamber should be a chamber where we have the opportunity to speak truth to power.
So what we must do is very simply the restoration of law, restoration of the principles of the Founding Father, restore the revolution that once started. Freedom is not something new and strange, and neither is it ancient. It's recent. The ideas of liberty were really introduced to the world through this country. We have been the freest and the most prosperous country in the history of the world. Tyranny is ancient. And unfortunately, this country is returning to tyranny, more and more centralized government and more control. We have lost our way because we've lost our confidence. We believe the government will take care of us. Since 9/11, it is assumed that we cannot be saved without the government. So the federal government, they come in and they register the people, and they want you to have a national ID card, which is the worst thing in the world you can have.
We have a lot of goodness in this country, and we should promote it, but never through the barrel of a gun. We should do it by setting good standards, motivating people, and have them want to emulate us. But you can't enforce our goodness like the neocons preach with an armed force.